Hey, good morning or good afternoon. I hope all is well wherever this finds you. As a person who always went to school on the first day of school and never paid enough attention as a kid, never paid enough attention on the first day or the first few weeks, I can tell you from firsthand experience what happens if, for example, you take a math class and you don't pay attention at the beginning. You can never sort of catch back up, right? The concepts build on each other, and if you haven't learned the first ones, it gets harder and harder as time goes on. The Bible is kind of like this. There is all sorts of depth and background to it, and it's kind of hard to understand the newer parts or where to go with or how to interpret any of this for our lives without understanding all the depth of it. So, for today, I'm going to read for you from the 15th chapter of Numbers. This is Good Shepherd Sunday. This is a Sunday where the readings have to do with God as our shepherd. This Sunday comes every year, no matter what year of the cycle of the lectionary we are, Good Shepherd Sunday. But this reading from the 15th chapter of Numbers really has nothing to do with shepherding, but it has a little bit, or maybe everything, to do with the background of today's gospel lesson, the gospel lesson for the 8th week of Pentecost from the 6th chapter of Mark. To really get it, you have to hear the first part, which is from all the way back in Numbers, the 15th chapter of Numbers. And this is what it says there, Numbers 15:39. You have the fringe, so that when you see it, you will remember all the commandments of the Lord and do them, and not follow the lust of your own heart and of your own eyes. That's what it says all the way back in a very antiquated commandment, God's law-driven part of the Old Testament, the 15th chapter of Numbers. And I want you to keep this in mind. And I want you to think of how the Bible leads us and how God uses the Bible and uses people to lead us to new places, and how there's a depth to our journey and how that journey is building. And I want you to remember this verse from the 15th chapter of Numbers. And then I'll visit with you a little bit and give you some background on this week's gospel from the 6th chapter of Mark. It begins at the 30th verse, Mark 6:30. This picks up right where last week left off, where there's that interlocution of the beheading of John the Baptist, the decollation of John the Baptist. Now we pick up in the 6th chapter of Mark with verse 30. It says there that the apostles gathered around Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught. So remember, Jesus went to his hometown, couldn't perform any miracles there, so he sent out the disciples. That was 2 weeks ago. Then we got that decollation of John the Baptist interjected in there, and now the apostles are coming back to Jesus after having been sent out. That's the way this story goes. And remember, things build here, so there's a lot of background. The word apostles in verse 30, that means those that are sent out, the sent ones. And because I want this to sort of fit the world that we live in, maybe it's the locked out ones or the isolated ones, the ones sent out and locked out. Maybe that's a little bit of how that feels. And Jesus said to the apostles, "Come away to a deserted place all by yourselves and rest for a while." So Mark loves his redundancies, and you can see this in here. Jesus said to them, "Come away to a deserted place." Okay, who else would be in a deserted place? It says all by yourselves. You know, if it's a deserted place, I would have already guessed that I was all by myself, but this is how Mark writes and talks. And what do you do in a deserted place? You rest for a while. Many of us might feel like we've done nothing but rest, and we're ready to get back to it. And we're ready to sort of do more than rest, but get back to normal. A lot of us might feel like it's been a long time of reinventing the wheel, and rest feels good. We're probably all over the board on this. but I always kind of laugh when Mark does this redundancy. It's supposed to just really hit home how quiet the place is and what a person does there. And it says that they went away by themselves in a boat to a deserted place. Now many saw them going and recognized them, and they hurried there on foot from all the towns and arrived ahead of them. So some of the background and the context of this is that Jesus is supposed to be, for the people of Israel, the new Moses. He's supposed to take people from the exile that they feel in their lives, the captivity that they feel in their lives, and bring them to the spiritual promised land. He's their Messiah, and it follows along with this imagery of Moses from the Old Testament. And so it's a trip. It's a journey. It's a sojourn. And, the reason why this fits Good Shepherd Sunday is because Jesus is a guide that takes us on a journey. And however worn out we might be, or however all over the place we might be, the idea of faith is that Christ is the head, the leader of a journey, and that our lives are a journey. And man, they've been crazier and wilder and gone all over the place more in the last couple of years than we could have ever guessed, I bet. But the idea of faith is that God, especially in Jesus, knows that it's a journey, that everything is building on each other and building and building and building, and that our lives are all about change and development. The older that I get, the more I realize that my resiliency and my ability to deal with any more of this change is super thin. But that's what life is. Life is a one day after another, building, building, building. And Jesus is the good shepherd because Jesus' presence, Jesus' teachings, the Holy Spirit is a process that goes with us no matter where we are on that journey. Some of us are old, some of us are young, some of us are in between. Some of us are experiencing one thing, some of us another thing. But God is always the leader of that whole pack, no matter where you are in the pack. And it builds and it builds and it builds. And this is what life is. Sometimes this challenges us, but this is meant to be a promise for God, that God is guiding us. God is the good shepherd, and God is taking us somewhere. So the gospel text for this Sunday now skips around. This is a way the lectionary works. In this week's reading of the Good Shepherd Sunday, it starts this sort of framework that leads into the feeding of the 5,000, which is Jesus' first Eucharistic act in the Gospel of Mark. But that's going to be saved for a later date. The lectionary skips it and comes back to it. Jesus is going to walk on water. That's one of the other ways that we know that Jesus can sort of shepherd through anything. Even water won't get in his way to keep that leadership going. But the lectionary also skips that. And it skips all the way down to 53. It's sort of the closing. We've gotten the framework, the opening part of those verses. The lectionary skips a bunch of them and then gives us the closing, verse 53 through 56. When they had crossed over, they came to land at Gennesaret and moored the boat. And when they got out of the boat, people at once recognized him. So this is about the people and all the people. And it's supposed to be about need, and it's supposed to be about following Jesus, and that Jesus is the great deliverer and meter of needs. And that's what this gospel is trying to build up. Verse 54, when they got out of the boat, people at once recognized him and rushed about that whole region and began to bring the sick on mats to wherever they heard he was. And now I want you to remember that reading from the 15th chapter of Numbers. I'm going to read the last verse for this Sunday's gospel. It's Mark 6:56. And remember that reading from Numbers 15:39. You have the fringe, so that when you see it, you will remember all the commandments of the Lord and do them, and not follow the lust of your own heart or your own eyes. Remember I read that to start? Here's why I read that. Mark 6:56. And wherever Jesus went, into villages or cities or farms, they laid the sick in the marketplaces and begged him that they might touch even the fringe of his cloak, and all who touched it were healed. This is a reference back to Numbers 15:39. The Good Shepherd is a building shepherd, and there's a lot coming up. You have to pay attention on the first day of school to be able to understand what's happening on the 200th day of school. In Numbers 15, we're told about fringe on the cloak of teachers or of Jewish folks that's there, that when it brushes up against them or they see it, they're supposed to remember God's commandments and where God is leading them instead of where their heart and where their lusts and where their eyes are leading them. I can't tell you enough that the gospel is countercultural. I can't say that to you enough. That the world calls us to live one way, and that the gospel in God's leadership asks us to live another. The way that the world asks us to live, it seems easier, but it's shallow. It has no depth to it, and when we need help, we find this to be shallow. But the lusts of our hearts and our eyes usually have us living there. We live so many of our days just trying to get by. We're worn out. We just want to order dinner and watch TV, and that's great and it's relaxing, but it doesn't have the depth of the place where God takes us away to. And so this fringe on the bottom of the teachers' cloaks is a reminder of the commandments and where to find God. And this is the place where all of these people who once led, who need guided, who want brought to the promised land, are touching. They're touching the fringe of Jesus' cloak, and he is now an intercessor for God's commandments, and he's pointing them back to God's commandments, to depth, to meaning. All of this is compounding. I know how hard life is. I know it because I've kind of reached a point of just complete being worn down and confusion and not even really knowing where God is a lot of times anymore. So we come to Good Shepherd Sunday together, remembering that we are the scattered church, remembering that purpose is hard to find, and that we keep going to our habits and finding them wanting when we really need things. But God is the Good Shepherd. When we touch that fringe, we're reminded of God's commandments, and those commandments can be harder and more complex than the commandments or the way the rest of the world works. But all these people, and all this need, and all this desperation is met in Christ Jesus. My hope is as we continue to try to gather together in front of the Good Shepherd as people who worship together, that we'll realize that God gives us purpose and direction, that purpose and direction will begin to sort out all the confusion, and more than anything, all this need, all these people who need so badly to be touched by God, myself included, can be brought back to the thing, the commandments of God, the way of life that God gives. It sets us back in a place of depth and care and quality. And so that is the background for this Sunday's Gospel. This Sunday's Gospel is from the 6th chapter of Mark. It cuts some of the pieces out of the middle, but it fits Good Shepherd Sunday. And I hope to see you this Sunday. We will commune together continuously once again, and we will again seek our shepherd. We'll bring our need before God, and instead of all the other places we look, we'll look for depth and care and provision that people of faith believe only God can provide. Thanks for joining me. I hope you have a great rest of the day. Stay safe, and I'll see you soon.